In this episode, we're talking about using movie and picture talks in the language classroom. I'm joined by Sarah Moghtader, a French teacher in Massachusetts who describes the benefits of movie and picture talks and walks us through the entire process. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively? If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I'm Joshua Cabral, and thank you for being here. I always have to start by saying thank you for being here. Thank you on behalf of your colleagues and your students because you're taking the time to look at your teaching, see that, oh, maybe there's something I can do better, or yes, this is exactly what I'm doing and it's great. So just thank you so much for taking the time to do that. Also, if you could just take 1 second, look at your phone, make sure that you are following or subscribing, whatever that app's telling you, to make sure that you get these episodes. And I'd also appreciate it if you could just maybe rate it, give it a little comment on whichever app you're on, because that makes sure that it gets out to other teachers as well. So now we're going to jump into today's topic, and we're going to be talking about picture talks and movie talks. And if you're sort of in the CI, comprehensible input world, and you're in conversations with teachers, these are likely terms that you know, and you're maybe even doing them. And if they're new to you, definitely stick around because by the end of this conversation, you're going to say, okay, I want to be trying this tomorrow. This sounds so cool. And I want to say that I was first really introduced to this whole process of doing a picture talk in a workshop. And you know that a lot of times I ask to have conversations with teachers on this podcast because I go to a lot of conferences. And when I sit in a workshop with someone who truly inspires me to want to try that activity the next day in my classroom, I want those teachers to be part of this conversation so you can hear it as well. So I was in a workshop at my state language association in Massachusetts, and I was in this workshop with Sarah Moghtader, and she was doing a workshop on a picture talk. And I just remember sitting there. First off, I love listening to her. So Sarah is a French teacher, and her French is beautiful. So if you ever get a chance to interact with her, so that was wonderful. But the way she presented this whole way of doing these picture talks with students and engaging them, I said, okay, I need to start doing this. So just a little bit of background on Sarah. As I said, she's a French teacher. She's been teaching for about 25 years and has done sort of the elementary, the high school, and she's right now in the middle school level, but not just here in the States. She taught in France and England and Colombia. So she has a lot of experience from different places around the world. And I really appreciate that her approach to all of this is I'm a teacher and I want to talk to you about my experience. And I think that's more important than a lot of even all the research and everything around it is what is working for you as a teacher in the classroom. So, Sarah, thank you so much for being with us here today.
I'm so happy to be here.
I kind of gave the high level look at who you are. And could you fill in the blanks a little for us so that we know like what makes you want to keep teaching and what brought you to French in the first place?
I'm one of those people that really loves learning through interacting with others. That's the thing that gets me going. And I was given those great experiences as a child as I was growing up. And so I want to set those up for my students. When I was young, it was sort of like the silly games at youth group and travel with my family and exchange programs with school and summer camp. But later on, then I was myself the youth group leader and the camp counselor. And then now later as a parent, I take my kids on travel abroad. So there was a time in my 20s and 30s when I lived and worked in other countries for about 7 years. And those were my best learning experiences. I
Mhm.
loved the challenge of navigating another culture, speaking a different language, and I learned so much. So now I continue. Now I'm, here in the States, and I continue my learning through interacting with other people from other countries and when I travel. But I also just like to get out there in the world. I like to be
Mhm.
outside, like to hike, bike, ski, all those good things, walk with a dog.
Yeah.
And those are the times for me. That's what gets me energized and gets me going.
Right. And you're in Massachusetts, correct? In Needham,
Yes.
Massachusetts is where you
Yes.
teach. So let's jump into this topic of the picture talks and movie talks. And the first thing, could you tell us what does that even mean?
So we have to really credit Dr. Ashley Hastings, who was an ELL teacher at the university level for this technique. And then it was Michelle Whaley who brought it to language teachers. So that's the most important thing that we need to say right off. But movie talk is a technique where you narrate what happens in a short video. And I myself do this by taking screenshots of the video and commenting on those as I look at them and show them to students. But you also could do it by just playing and hitting pause. And as it pauses, you see the still image and you talk about it. So the videos that I use in Movie Talk are 3 to 5 minutes. And the idea that I have to get across to you is that those videos are great because they tap into the intrinsic
Mhm.
curiosity of students. And the videos usually offer like a social commentary or a twist. They're really the best when they have a twist. And so that, in a nutshell, is what a movie talk is.
So I'm using the terms movie talk and picture talk a little interchangeably, and I know they're not exactly the same, but would that essentially be the same thing with a picture talk where you're using a picture book rather than a movie? Am I doing that justice?
Yes, yes. So I think the thing that brings it together is those are both ways to tell a story, right? And so if the story is a set of still images, the story is still going to advance from one image to the next.
Yeah, so when you're taking the screenshots that you were talking about in a movie, you're essentially turning it into a picture book of telling the story that way. Yes.
Yes.
Why are these useful, or sort of what's the benefit of this approach to language teaching?
Well, an image and a video has so much richness to it. And these create the context of a story for our learner. And the language is easier to understand because they have this image or this moving image to look at. So we're hoping that we can move students' acquisition along more quickly because of the richness of that image. Like, so basically, in my classes, right, I can talk about what you did last weekend or what you want to do after school today, right? And then at some point, I kind of hit a wall of what I can come up with just with who's here, the context. So to bring in this new content, I now have a video that's interesting that pulls them in, and it creates that context that I want. It gives us something to talk about, I guess is what I'm really saying. And the video is compelling and holds the student's interest. And it gives me a chance to do that teacher talk, to basically take a language, not dumb it down, but use some really comprehensible language so that I can get my students to understand what I'm saying. I can point at the images, I can bring them in through the story. They're hooked a little bit more, and that offers us that context. Now, because I'm a critical thinker, I also have to tell you the limitations. You didn't ask for them, but I'm going to tell you them anyway.
These are good. It's the truth and the reality behind it.
For me, there's people that do storytelling every day, right? And I have to say that I think I did TPRS for 10 years, but in my classroom, it was never what I did every day. I'm one of those people that I like choose a theme, an essential question. I look at my assessment. I write my communicative can-dos. And then for me, I usually go out and find my authentic documents. And at that point in my unit, I start to put in the times I'm going to really discuss with students. So this technique for me is a time where I'm like, oh, I couldn't get at that through my authentic document. I want to tell a story. I want to get us talking through that. So I already have the culture elsewhere in my unit. usually in these authentic documents. A movie talk might be, because it's a silent film short frequently, it might be from a culture that's not the culture that I'm trying to teach. So it might even sort of be kind of devoid of culture. It's not really bringing anything out. So that's a limitation, right? So I just need to make sure that the culture comes out in a different way. And then secondly, in this technique where I'm using these images and talking to students about it, and then that's kind of the language that they're talking back to me, that parroting can not really be true communication, right? You don't want your whole class to be kind of about them trying to remember what you just said and say it back to you, because that's not communication. So you have to find those times, and as language teachers, we know how to do that, to get at true communication. Usually with a movie talk, that can happen with the twist and the students talking about what they believe is going to happen next, and then reacting to each other about what they said, whether that's realistic or not.
I like the fact that you sort of pointed out it's not something I do in my class. Like always, it's just the only method. And what I truly hope teachers get out of listening to all the conversations on this podcast is you're going to find those pieces and you're going to put the puzzle together and it's going to work in your classroom. And it's not just going to be this idea of there's one method and go all in with it and you just do that, where you're saying there are going to be times when the movie talk is what's going to work, and then you're going to do something else later on in the class or tomorrow. So I appreciate that lens, putting it on there. And you also used one of my favorite words when we talk about comprehensible input. You said compelling. In this whole comprehensible input conversation, it just makes sure the language has to be understandable, and that's how they're going to acquire it. And no, they have to actually want to listen and engage with that language if they're going to acquire it. So I appreciate the bringing it up with that as well. So now what I would like to do, and this is something I particularly appreciated when I've been to workshops that you do on this, can you walk us through what a lesson would look like, and kind of give us a time frame, like how long it would take, and how do you begin? How do you work through it and kind of bring closure to it?
So because I teach middle school students, I usually like to do my movie talks over the course of 2 days and then move on to something new. I think that what I'm going to give you, the ideas I'm going to give you here, you could extend it further than that for a different level or a different interest. But that's what I do. And so you're going to begin finding your video, and I will tell you later a good place to go to find those videos to get started with. And you'll take your video and decide on the images you want to use, either by pausing as you play it or by taking the screenshots. And at that point, you're ready. So you bring it to the students. You probably want to teach some targeted vocabulary. And you know this from when we were doing TPRS, is there's different ways that people like to do that. So there's translation, there's getting people to do a gesture to show what it means. And then for me, I like to do the circumlocution and examples and try to talk through the words to have my students understand them by just using the language. But I don't worry at all if I then have to say to them, did you understand that? And let me give you the word in English. I don't think that that's a problem.
So, two things, just to get a little bit into the weeds. When you say you're taking screenshots and then showing them to students, are you generally putting that on Google Slides or PowerPoint?
Yes, Google Slides.
And the next one is when you're talking about this language that students are understanding or producing as you go through the story, are you choosing the language that you want to focus on, the specific structures and vocabulary in advance, or is it more organic to what comes out as you're going through?
I choose the movies that I'm going to use, the film shorts that I'm going to use, based on them having something in them that I know my students already know how to say. Because when we go into a story, there's so much new vocabulary. So I would love to not have to teach part of it. So maybe there's a commercial, maybe you've seen this one, where there's a dancing piece of paper, scissors,
Mm-hmm.
and rock, right? And we know that our students know how to say paper and scissors, the very basic, at the very basic level, because we've talked about those items in the classroom, right? And so that was a really easy commercial for me to decide to do a movie talk on. But after I had already taught that vocabulary.
So that's interesting. The that clarification for me personally is it's not necessarily always because they have to be learning new words and structures by watching this. It's really an opportunity for them to engage using the language that they already have.
Yes.
We have the pictures, and we're ready to dive into the process.
So here you have a decision to make. Do you want to hand your students a story that's basically all typed out and have them do some reading first? Do you want to have those screenshots and have some sentences on the same slide that you read aloud to your students before you go into the narration phase? I've done that before with real novices. I think that could be a good step. Otherwise, you're ready to narrate your story now. So the narrating of the story is where you do that circling. And I have to be very specific about this because I don't think that I understood this early on when I was doing TPRS stories. Circling is basically a chance for students to get input when you're talking. And so it's when they're responding to you, they're just responding to you to show understanding. So one of these videos is a girl serving coffee in a cafe and a zombie comes up to the door, right? And so I might say in my circling or in my questions for students, is the zombie driving a car? And they don't see a car anywhere in the image, so they say no. Oh, is the zombie entering a cafe? That's my yes/no question. I am giving them the language that they see in the picture that they're looking at. I'm delivering the input, and it's not about the output. Then I might do the either or questions. And again, it's not really about them figuring out how to say the word. So like, is the server serving coffee or soda, for example, right? And it's about them hearing the words coffee and soda. It's not about them doing the output. Is the server happy to see the zombie, or is the server scared to see the zombie? So you see what I'm doing is I'm narrating, but I'm asking some questions in order to give further repetition of the terms. And then I'm going back to re-narrate what I said before, to repeat. I advance the story a little bit in my narration. I go back, I repeat. And basically, over the course of the slides, I tell the story.
And when you're doing the circling and asking the questions, is it sort of a choral response from students, or are you picking on individuals?
Yes, that's very important to say. It's the choral response. So basically, we're just having this moment that we're sharing together in the classroom, telling the story. And that could have been a story that I made up. But for some reason, for me, these film shorts give an interesting story that seems to engage the students more than those stories that I was making up before.
And so, as they're working through it, do you have them doing anything with it? I mean, they're engaging, they're listening and responding as they're going through. But do you have them sort of physically doing anything, like writing anything down or manipulating anything as part of that? Or is the focus on like you and the language?
The focus is on me and the language. I'm intending for all of their eyes to be up at the front of the room. Now, like we did with TPRS, you can also have a student be a character in the story. That's absolutely possible too. I don't happen to do that. I tend to tell the story with the images that are up there.
And so when I come across what I think is a decent little video and I think it's funny or something, it's not necessarily going to be useful for this activity just because I find it interesting. So, what should I specifically be looking for in a book or a story or a movie clip that would be useful for this process?
For me, I'm looking
Mhm.
that it's compelling. It goes back to that again. So I think that because I'm a language teacher, I probably also know what's the right level of language for students. So I'm sure that that's part of the decision as well. I'm advancing my students on to be able to talk about something that fits into their level of language, the text type that they're able to do.
And so once you've worked through it, maybe over a single class or two classes over 2 days, what are students then going to do? What's sort of the extension activity? How are they going to engage with the story and the language once you've sort of finished the narration of it?
So we get to the cliffhanger as I'm telling the story, and I stop there. I don't tell the story any further. And so at that point, what do you think is going to happen next? And because this is more, we want it to be more student centered than teacher centered, you can have students speak to each other about that next step. Allow everybody in the room to get a chance to talk by putting them in pairs and having them do a turn and talk. And they explain to their partner what they think is going to happen next. Now, you've given them a lot of input because what's going to happen next is going to have to do with the same characters, with the same scenario that's already going on. So they've got some language there. And then they tell either their partners, like, oh, did anybody hear their partner say something that was interesting? Can you share it with us in the larger group? Oh, who wants to tell me what they thought was going to happen next? And then we show the video. They get to see the video from the beginning to the end. And so now they get a chance to react. And we've all done this a million times as teachers. Don't react in English. I want to hear that reaction in the target language, right? So I expect you not to discuss this until you're ready to discuss it in the target language. So, maybe give them a little bit of scaffolding for that. And at that point, the students are now ready to attempt to tell the story themselves. So that would be the next piece of it. And I tend to have like a matching at that point where there's sentences that they can read. It's more of a reading activity than anything else. They can match up the sentences to be captions to the different pictures. I also sometimes put up pictures on the board and number them. And I describe one of those pictures and they tell me which number it is. So sort of like moving a little bit away from the first step into the second step, I'm having them be more responsible for it. And then we can also get to the point where those pictures that are up, like maybe out of all the screenshots I took, I have 6 or 8 pictures up on the board. I'm going to ask them to start to try to retell the story by telling in these specific pictures what is happening.
In that case, I guess this would depend on their proficiency level, but do they retell the story in the third person or in the first person as if they're in the story?
In the third person. So for me, this is a technique to really get at describing. And as we know from Actful, stories are so important to us to be able to retell a story. Those are right there written into the communicative can-dos. So we want to make sure that we can tell a story ourselves.
And do you keep that mostly oral, or have you done with a retelling the story in writing as well?
Yes. So if we want to talk about some of the activities that come after, absolutely. You can do this the first time you tell the story as well. You could not have the pictures up there. What I tend to do is tend to have different boxes when I'm going to ask students to do that. And I'll tell them, okay, I'm going to tell you the first bit of the story, and then I want you to illustrate that in the first box. All right, now I'm going to tell you the second part of the story. I want you to put that in the second box. And so students can do that. And that could be a pre-activity, or it could be a post-activity, either way. A lot of times I've done ed puzzles afterwards because I love that the ed puzzle stops the individual student as they're listening to it to ask a question. I've done sequencing activities. We already talked about drawing the story as they listen to the script. And then the TPRS technique of checking for comprehension, where you do thumbs up or thumbs down so the teacher says a statement. That type of true-false statement really lends itself well to the marker game, the spoon game. I don't know what you call it when you play it, but the students have a marker in between them. The teacher says a statement. If the statement's true, the students scramble to grab the marker and they get a point if they get it. So then what I love is the retell. So when students are doing that retell, one of my favorite things is the group retell, when everybody adds a detail. But what we do is we stand in a circle and the students around the edge of the circle have to tell one detail. But if we get to the end of the story before everybody's spoken, We have to go back and do it again. That's one of my favorites. You can retell in pairs. You can do a blind retell where this whole story is up on the board and there's one student who's facing their partner. The partner can see the story, but the person facing them can't. And they try to retell the story and the partner can add in details to help them out. Now, the last thing I'm going to tell you, to me, has been huge for drawing these out. And I have to say that this is my favorite part. I like to do a movie talk and then afterwards have students in pairs talk about what just happened, then have them talk to the class about what's just happened, and then have us together write a paragraph, write the story. I'm writing at the board so they can all see it. I'm kind of correcting as I go. The students are retelling the story. Then I have them all look at the story. I read it out loud to them. And then finally, I ask them to write the story themselves.
And are they looking at the pictures to do that, or are they doing it from memory?
I usually have up on my whiteboard 6 to 8 pictures that kind of sum up the story that we can keep on referring to while we're doing that on a regular whiteboard where I'm writing, while we're writing on the whiteboard.
Do you ever have students find clips, because they're always on YouTube, and suggest them to you? Has that ever happened?
Those are the best ones. Students love to be a part of this because what I think is going to be interesting to them is never what's as interesting as the pictures.
Yeah. You kind of teased us a little earlier about where we can find these videos. And so where's your watering hole for that?
We're very lucky that there's a movie talk database. And so that's an address that's been shared, and you and I will share it with listeners. It's basically tinyurl.com/movie talk database. So it's very simple.
Yeah, I'll make sure that's in the show notes for sure.
The other thing you really need to make sure that everybody does is listen to Martina Beck's do a movie talk. She has it on her Comprehensible Classroom website. And that, again, is another easy URL, but we're going to share it with people, comprehensibleclassroom.com/how-to with a dash between how and to/movie talk. And then I'd also like to offer my website because I've done a lot with movie talk on it as well. And so mine is Madame, written as MME, no punctuation, Moghtader, MOGHTADER.com.
Yeah, make sure all of those are in the show notes so that we can easily get there. I know that on your website you have one of you call them your 20-minute videos, right? Is that how you termed them? About doing a movie talk with visuals and everything, which I'm sure teachers that are listening, to have the visuals along with you explaining it would be really helpful. And that's on your website. It seems like that's where your inspiration's coming from, those couple of people you mentioned right there. But outside of that, are there conferences or people out there that just you learn from pretty regularly? Like, where does Sarah keep getting her inspiration from?
AATF, absolutely, which is the National French Organization, as well as IF Prof, which is where AATF has had a lot of us post some different things. But where's my real, I think it's on Twitter and talking to people, people that I know. And there's a couple of people out there that I know how they teach, and I love to hear everything that they do. And most of all, I keep in touch with them through Twitter.
It's pretty amazing, the things that come through on Twitter. It's the perfect place where somebody will do a movie talk and put the clip on to what they did. And it's like, there's my lesson for tomorrow, so it's definitely such a wonderful place for collaboration. Okay, so this is the point in the conversation where I like to pull the teacher curtain back a little bit and get to know you a little bit more as a person, to sort of see, what is your life like when you're not being a French teacher? So it's this or that. Just choose one and maybe say briefly why. And usually that sparks a little more commentary in there. Okay, so here's the first one. And based on something you said a little while ago, I think I know the answer to this one already. But are you more of, I'm going to go off the beaten path for an adventure, or stick around and have an urban adventure?
Oh, wow, because I love cities. But yes, off the beaten path.
You like the hiking world. But But you're also an urban. You like the cities as well.
I love cities. I've lived in London and in Paris, and I love both of those cities. And I just love being anonymous and walking around the city. So, yes, that's part of it too. It might be that I don't really have a preference between the two. I like both.
Oh, yeah, which is sometimes happens. Sometimes happens. Okay, the next one. Would you consider yourself more of an introvert or an extrovert?
I am more of an introvert. I love to read. I love to think. I need to be reflective every day about what I've done that
Hmm.
day.
What's your genre of reading that you prefer?
I tend to read realistic fiction.
And this last one, are you okay with loose guidelines or do you need really clear directions?
I need really clear directions. I'm super concrete. I'm kind of like stuck as a middle school person myself. And in
Hmm.
fact, I have to tell you that when I was studying the literature of decolonization in
Hmm.
London, I had a professor say to me, you know, when you write your papers, you kind of sound like you're explaining everything to a 14-year-old. And I had to say, yes, I am all the time.
All the time, all the time. All right, excellent. So I'm sure that our listeners are going to be jumping onto the websites that I'll put in the show notes that you mentioned earlier. And if they want to connect with you, they can definitely go to your website. But what are some other ways they might connect with you to talk more about movie talks?
So I'm going to have you post my Twitter handle.
Hmm.
And that's probably a great way is to send me a message on Twitter.
And what is your Twitter handle?
It's at WLDLENG Toolbox.
And before we say our goodbyes, I'm just wondering, can you leave us with one sort of solid piece of advice if we want to take on movie talk or picture talk in our classroom?
I think I told you at the beginning of this that I learn from interacting with other people. And with our students, it's really all about the relationship. So, do they feel like the class today was something that included them?
Well, thank you so much for your insights today. And I'm sure everyone's very excited to try this out with their students or to do even more of it if already they've tried it out and now they hear you talking about it and like, oh, I want to go back and try that again. So thank you so much for inspiring us all to take on movie talk in our classroom.
You're very welcome. I so much enjoyed speaking with you.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Sarah Moghtader? If you're new to movie and picture talks, I hope that you now have a solid understanding, and I hope that you will try it out really soon. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Sarah. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. Talk to you soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.